Afternoon, and welcome to the sixth Communication Matters panel at Royal Roads. We're here in the Center for Dialogue, and my name is Jeffrey Orr. I'm an instructor in the BA for Professional Communications, and I'm joined today by three very knowledgeable panel experts from the BAPC. Carrie Coles, who is a professional photographer with a background in environmental and cultural photojournalism, and she's returned to the BAPC to gain more tools in thoughtful stories relating to culture, environment, and politics, as well as Tishine Kara, a diehard BBC fan with experience in media management for international audiences, who's worked in Canada, Middle East, Latin America, and East Africa. And she'll be talking about the evolution of journalism. Samantha Joy is a writer, blogger, and aspiring journalist. She's got a background in adventure guiding, community sport and recreation, and nonprofit program development. And she's a technical writer who studied at SFU. We're very pleased to be joined today by a wonderful audience here live and also by our online audience. So welcome to you as well. Our topic today is the future of journalism. And we'll be discussing that for the next half hour from a variety of different perspectives. So I think we should probably jump right in. And I think, Carrie, maybe we'll start with you. I'd like to ask you how you think digital evolution has changed the reporting of news and journalism. And maybe more specifically, do you think it's improved it?
Well, I think one of the features that it's really brought forward is that it's leveled the playing field to a certain degree. Everybody has a voice now, and what we're finding with that is niche journalism is happening, and so I think there's the ability to really get into stories quite a bit deeper than when news organizations were trying to have a really broad, little looks at a very broad area. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that one of the biggest advantages of the new digital evolution is just, those niche pockets of being able to really get in depth into stories.
Interesting. Tishine, any comments on that?
Yeah, actually, I think digital evolution has increased immediacy, but it's decreased accuracy because anybody can report the news or anybody can give information or put information online. That information doesn't always get checked through. And so sometimes it's not factual, which is why we end up with a lot of news stories that sometimes end up being disproven because they didn't actually happen the way that they were reported. So I think it's a mixed bag.
Especially with Twitter, there's been a real emphasis on speed over accuracy. Any thoughts on specific media?
Nothing on specific media. I mean, definitely everyone can now be a publisher. Everyone can produce content and put it out. That's the beauty of the digital evolution. And yeah, speaking to accuracy, there is definitely that element to it. But I think, for me, I think it's just a positive. I mean, even when you talk about speed versus the accuracy of what's being reported, I think things like Twitter increase the number of people involved in stories and discourse so exponentially that it's worthwhile. Any sort of downside is outweighed by the benefit.
I think picking up on that then, we've been talking a fair bit about the kind of massive increase in content production, and I wondered if you had any sense of the way in which local content, and maybe even hyper-local content, relates to the international. Do you feel like that's becoming an issue with niche markets, or is there room for both the general and the very, very local? Tishine, you've got some experience with the international scene. Maybe you could start us off.
Okay, well, I think that local journalism is great because it gives a voice to all populations and even people who are maybe not used to looking at international news. But I think there's a saturation point at which people stop being able to absorb information. So an overabundance of local information means that people become slightly ignorant about the international market and or the international news and what's happening there. But I think that journalists who are able to take local stories and relate them to international stories, or take international incidences and relate them to local stories, are maybe maybe the people who will be the most successful going forward, because they'll be able to offer perspective of the local and the international and help people at the local level understand international events.
Carrie, any thoughts on that relationship between the local versus the global?
Well, I think curation is such a huge part of online media now, and so I think it's those curators that are pulling those bits together, and going back to the niche journalism, it's someone might have an interest in human rights, and so they'll be pulling stories from North America on human rights and from Africa, and so I think it actually is possibly more enriching that way, and I think also looking at the Panama Papers, where now we have access to this global reporting and we can tie the local stories together in that way. So I think it's not, I don't think we lose in the local or the international. I think it actually allows more conversation around it.
It's a great example, I think. Anything to add on that one, Samantha?
No, I think you guys have said it. I think it's about community building. And you build the community in the local market, and then you manage to connect it. That's definitely how the global market community gets built as well.
So do you feel that building the local community is a way of building international communities, or do those need to be done?
No, I think I think like Tasheen said, you do get a saturation point, and it's the people who can connect those local stories and those local values and issues to the greater global stories that are going on, who are going to find greater success. But I don't think you can connect readers or consumers of media to global stories without engaging them at a local level first. So they coexist, they have to coexist.
Great. So we've got a kind of relationship between the immediacy of lived experience and the kind of abstract generalization of news with a capital N.
Accessibility, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay then, sticking with that, and speaking of accessibility, what about all these new ways of creating content? Do you feel like there's a rise of independent journalism and the way that the blurring of lines between readers and contributors, is that creating ethical challenges for journalism or for the future of journalism?
I think it is. Personally, I do. I think the whole idea of branded journalism is something that we really need to look at, and we need to generate more, I guess, public awareness of the fact that this is going on, that this is, we now have more public relations and marketing people than we do journalists, and we have people who are doing this sort of cross-migration from PR and marketing into journalism and producing journalistic content that is very branded. So that, I think that's a concern for sure.
Carrie, thoughts?
I think it is a concern. I think there's always sort of been branded media. Like, it's not a new issue. I think it is a more prevalent issue. I also feel like it's part of the evolution. I feel like we'll get that piece figured out. I think we're just not there yet. So I think it'll take some work, but.
In terms of the role of advertising, or the kind of
I think
niche of advertising within the story?
I think having some rules around how things are presented, and just having some standards as far as, I feel like it was a bit of a free-for-all initially, and I feel like now it needs to,
Considering all of the different ways that this content is being created, it just seems such an enormous task, right?
Yeah.
How do you start to lay down the foundation of what people are presenting and how they present it? What kinds of regulations can you set on that when there are so many digital avenues to get the information out there?
Yeah.
Isn't that part of this online, part of the beauty of being online is that anybody can post and and there is almost no regulation, and information becomes commodified because as soon as a news story that's legitimate is there, an advertiser is able to put a spin on it. And so maybe more independent online newspapers like The Guardian, for example, would be an avenue for finding honest, unbiased journalism.
All right. I wondered what unbiased means in a context.
That's a loaded term.
Such a loaded term.
It's more than a half hour.
It's certainly worth thinking about, though, isn't it? I think while we're on that kind of a track, it might be useful to think about the relationship between advertising and journalism a little bit, especially since we've seen an increase in things like paywalls and pay-to-play advertising, things like social media, specifically Facebook, increasingly as a news delivery service. Facebook is now the largest news delivery service in the world. I wonder how you feel about the role of secondary advertising, insofar as it's traditionally, over the last 2 centuries, supported the mainstream paper media, and whether you think that's going to continue or whether it's going to change. Tisha, thoughts?
Well, I know for some online papers, when you go to access them, if you have an ad blocker, they won't allow you to see their site. And they'll give you an option. You can turn off the ad blocker and contribute to our newspaper, or you can turn on your ad, or turn it off so that the ads can pop up and they can receive revenue that way. And so that feels like the same kind of advertising as you would get at the bottom of your newspaper, for example. So while online newspapers don't necessarily, like the BBC, for example, doesn't like to have banner ads at the bottom, they do collect information, and they do use that information for advertising purposes. So maybe it's the same thing, just a different way.
Maybe, yeah. Thoughts?
There's been many studies, but Cisco is predicting that I think by 2019, 80% of online media is going to be video. And when you're in video, you're a captive audience. You have to watch it. And so I think as far as advertising goes, that's a huge bonus for the advertising world.
You mean in terms of intro advertising or something?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point. The captivity of the audience for video is very different from that jumpy ability to move around stories on a page.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know where I see the future of advertising fitting in with journalism, to be honest. Like the branded content is clearly there, so there's that aspect, but just the way that it's worked traditionally, the money literally coming from advertisers to support reporters and the media room and all of that stuff, we're seeing that that's over. That's why newsrooms are closing down. That's why reporters are losing their jobs. And so I don't see that traditional model transferring over to what we're creating now. And I don't know what will replace that. Because that is a relationship that has to exist somehow. That's where the money comes from.
Yeah, I think the loss of newsrooms is something that's really affecting a lot of a lot of news gathering capacity, but also an ability to build public consensus and to build public trust. Right? That idea that you can trust the source because of the consistency of the way that they gather news is disappearing as newsrooms disappear.
I don't think people realize the loss of reporters and what that means to the integrity of the information that we're getting, and that this was a whole sector of people who were trained specifically to do a job that is very quickly disappearing. So that is linked to advertisers, and I don't know how we replace that.
Well, I think it's interesting what news organizations are doing in order to combat that. So like the Vancouver Observer just did that huge Kickstarter campaign, and they were gearing it around the environment and climate change. And so it was like, okay, we're wanting to put so many reporters on this to do some really in-depth research, so we need this much funding. and that was quite successful. So I thought that was kind of a neat way to deal with it. And then there was another Blacklock reporter, I think it is. Yeah, Blacklock reporter, and they've got a paywall, and their whole thing was that you can't be providing something that's free already. So they're in Ottawa, and they do a lot of, around legislation and stuff like that. And they were like, okay, well, we're not doing press releases, we're not going to press conferences because all that stuff is free online. So why would we cover it? And so they're all about creating content that is people want to pay for because there's value in that. There's a need for that. And so they use a paywall structure where I think it's subscription based. And so it's just neat. Again, we're sort of in the beginning of this whole transition, right? We're just figuring all this stuff out. And so I actually find it super fascinating watching how different organizations go about tracking down the dollar to make this work, so.
That really speaks to the differentiation between reporting and journalism as well, where reporting is about the facts and journalism is about cultural analysis. Well, I wondered if any of you had thought through how that division might survive the kind of coming changes in journalism, and whether or not you feel that there'll be a stronger role for cultural analysis, or how that will look in the future. You find the long form becoming more of something that people are willing to pay for?
I think it is. I think unfortunately the lines are blurred between reporting and journalism. It's like for a long time now that's been happening where people don't understand necessarily the difference between an editorial piece and a news piece. And that's part of sensation.
Or an advertorial for that.
An advertorial, yeah, that's true. And that's part of sensationalism of journalism, getting people hooked in to the stories, selling your content. So I personally would love to see more actual journalism, those hard-hitting journalists who like to analyze culture. But what we're seeing instead is those people are going into marketing and PR, and they're doing what they do best and using their skills to produce branded material for startups and in companies that way, and that's how they're getting their jobs. They're not able to sell their content and what they're good at to publications that would normally have paid them for those types of things. So.
Do you guys agree with that? Are we just becoming a society of clickbait monkeys?
Yeah, look at BuzzFeed. I mean, BuzzFeed and their BuzzFeed News with its advertorials smattered throughout. I mean, I think you're really right, Sam, that it's we're definitely going towards that. And a lot of people who would have the time and energy and kind of consciousness to write op-ed pieces and editorials don't have a platform to go to anymore because the barriers to entry for a big magazine or newspaper are quite significant. To get in there to write a piece, you have to be successful in order to be engaged at a newspaper level to write those pieces. And so I think without there being a sort of a practicing ground, which might be the online forum, maybe what will happen is that enough people will practice advertorials and they'll be able to start writing editorials if the money shows up for it.
It's kind of a vicious circle, though,
it is,
right? Because
yeah.
Going back to the idea of advertisers, many of the larger publications that would have the money or the means to publish these editorials, they have very stringent rules about what they can publish based on their advertisers. So sort of running into roadblocks all over the place.
Yes, that's why we have blogs.
Yeah.
Maybe. Unseen roadblocks, I think, based on pre-existing advertising contracts, right? Well in the background of the actual work.
There's a new app coming out. It's just in a beta version, but it's called Blendle, and there's no ads, and it's all high-quality, long-form articles. And it's a curation process, so they're pulling from a bunch of different places. But it's like a pay-per-click or pay-per-article, so it's kind of like the iTunes of articles, which I think is brilliant because it's, those little increments you don't mind so much. It's like, oh, that's a super interesting article. Yeah, I'd pay $1 to read that. Whereas, well, will I pay $30 a month for a subscription? I don't know. And so I think that I'm interested to see how that plays out, because I think that might be an effective way of
Yeah, micro
payments. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to a comment you made earlier, Carrie, about the captive audience in video. I wonder if any of you feel that there's been a visual turn in journalism in the last few years, and that we're increasingly seeing more photojournalism, more video, more direct storytelling through the image rather than through language. And if you do, maybe you could speak to how you think that's going to impact the future of journalism. Is that a return to older forms of storytelling and engagement? Is it a move towards a new way of understanding the world around us? Two questions at once. It's a terrible interview technique. I apologize. What do you think of video? How about that one? Maybe we should start with a professional photographer.
I'm pretty excited that it's heading in that direction. I do think that now, in the journalism world, you do have to have so many more tools in your toolkit. There's this expectation that you can do the online, you can write articles, you can do video, you can do social media, and all of that stuff. And so, yeah, it's exciting. I think people do expect it again with the stats of 80% is going to be video. That's a huge amount, and I think it's engaging. There's hearing people's voices tell a story as opposed to reading written words on a page. I think there's a lot of impact in that. So I do think that it can bring a lot to the table. I still really enjoy reading, so I hope it's balanced out. But
as if it was a nostalgic engagement.
Oh, reading! I remember the days.
Shane, any thoughts on the pictorial turn?
Yeah, I was thinking what you said about how as a journalist you're expected to know how to have like multiple skill sets. So I was reading this article on the BBC about the BBC rather, and somebody from their school of journalism was saying that people who come to work for the BBC are expected to know how to do video, how to write, how to take audio, how to do all of those things. And it made me think with this Syrian crisis, so many articles were written, so many videos were produced, but that one picture of Alan Kurdi, that stopped everybody in their tracks. And everybody paid attention to that because, they say a picture paints 1,000 words, right? And so a video must paint 10,000. And a video is something that you can engage with at multiple levels. And especially now that we're in a newer form of digital media where it's not a solid one video piece where it's just focused on one person. They're able to put in so many background images. They're able to add text to it. And so I definitely think that video is the way of the future, and maybe there'll be a bit more combination of reading and video together for nerds like us.
Yeah, the video thing is definitely, there's no escaping it, but I personally think it's very dangerous. I think it's a dangerous way to deliver news. I think it's a dangerous way to deliver any type of journalistic content simply because the production value that is possible and the manipulation factor. So, obviously, along with that comes the hope that people will become more literate in media tools and understand what it is that they're seeing and all of that, but I very much doubt that will happen. So it's not a positive, in my opinion.
Did you guys see that movie Wag the Dog? I don't know if anybody's seen it.
Oh yeah, that's
right,
years
where they
ago.
it's really so they basically they make up a whole war in the
yeah.
basement of the White House and film these segments and put it together and convince the population that there's a war going on. And I agree with you, that's one of the dangers of video is you can't dig deeper, you can't reference
Well, in the emotional, I mean, Carrie, you said, you can hear the person's voice, but I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing. I think sometimes we just need to read the facts, or we need to read a narrative account. And yes, there are manipulations that you can do in writing as well, but it's slightly less, and it's from a different angle. You're not as immersed. When you're watching a video, you're completely immersed in that situation, and it's affecting you on a very emotional level, because you are seeing this person, you're hearing them, you're seeing the situation, whatever it is. So it definitely adds just an angle where you're maybe not, as you're engaging with it, also able to think about other things or put other ideas into that moment.
Video's an immersive medium, isn't it? It's really hard to think critically about a video while you're watching it. By the same token, you can stop reading a paragraph wherever you want and think about the logic of it, think about the voice, the tone, perspective. I think that's much more difficult when you're getting those fast cuts in video. Then what about rich text? What about that format with the embedded videos, or with the ways in which we might argue that a story can engage with multiple formats? Is that building a greater relationship to the real world or to truth? Big capital letters.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bloated.
Would data viz be a part of that? Data visualization?
Maybe.
I'm totally obsessed with it right now. I just think it's so cool, because it's taking, big numbers, and again, this can be totally manipulated. You have to be super careful about.
Like infographics, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and in video format. So again, there's a lot of room for error in what's chosen to be depicted. But I think if done properly, I think it can engage in a way that numbers on a page don't.
Well, and some of these are traditional journalistic values. Journalists have always chosen which part of a story to highlight, or which facts to talk about and which facts to ignore, right? But yeah, I don't think they're the same, actually. I don't think that the idea of data visualization and media presented in a video format are exactly the same thing. I think those are two different.
What's the difference?
In my opinion. Because I think data visualization is literally looking at facts presented in a way that can be very quickly digested visually, right? That's the point. Whereas a video or video media is generating an emotional response. It's visceral, right?
They're both really immediate, though, and that's kind of, I think, increasingly the point of where this panel seems to be going. Do you think that the immediacy of delivery is going to increase? Is it going to do something positive for our reaction and engagement with the world?
Does it make us anxious?
It does seem to me that a 24-hour news cycle increases anxiety in the viewing public. I wonder if a 45-minute news cycle is going to make that almost unbearable. Any thoughts on the increasing speed of the news cycle?
Well, I just wanted to speak to that last point about the numbers. And I just wanted to say that I think I agree with you that that using numbers is not the same as watching video. But when numbers and data are used for persuasive means and not for honest, like not to present the facts, but to be persuasive, then those numbers then can be visceral. You can see a statistic.
It becomes like punctuation, I suppose.
Yeah,
right?
and it can add to it. And that's what I think in terms of immediacy, in terms of getting news even more frequently, it will have to be boiled down to those kind of numerical sound bites in order for people to understand and move on. Because if you're delivering news that often, and you keep repeating it's a sensationalized story, it loses its effect after a while, I think. I don't know.
Final thoughts? No? Okay. Maybe we should leave it there. I'd like to thank our panel once again, Carrie Coles, Teshin Kara, and Samantha Joy. It's been a pleasure listening to your ideas on this. I think it's been really helpful, both for our audience here and our audience online. And from Rural Roads, I'd like to say thank you for being here, for joining us today, and I hope that we'll see you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.